Welcome back to Flickr Recaps. Today we're recapping a sci-fi romance drama film from 2016, Passengers. But beware, spoilers ahead. Interstellar spaceship Avalon is hurtling through space on the way to a colonized world called Homestead 2. All its quarters are empty and the vessel is on autopilot. The 258 crew members as well as the 5,000 passengers are in hibernation. Suddenly, the ship passes through an asteroid belt, weakening its shields. Power is diverted to the main shield, but the ship is on a collision course with a giant asteroid. Suddenly, the asteroid collides with the vessel, causing various malfunctions. The ship begins self-reparations, but one of the hibernation pods activates. The pod belongs to passenger and mechanical engineer Jim Preston. As he wakes up, his pod opens. An automated system explains that he's spent 120 years in suspended animation and that the ship is only 4 months away from Homestead 2. He finds out that he will be able to enjoy the spacecraft and its luxury amenities during that time. Jim receives instructions about his ID band, cabin, and the activities he's to participate in before his arrival on the planet. He's excited and nervous about meeting the people on the ship. He gets ready, leaves his cabin, and heads into an automated classroom to join a learning group. Jim looks a little anxious as the hologram explains the situation on Earth, describing it as overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. He's told to wait until the end of the class to ask any questions, but Jim continues to ask why he's the only one there. He realizes that the hologram can't answer him and leaves to search for other people. He makes it to the main concourse of the ship. No one is there either, but an automated information desk offers to help. Jim asks to talk to a real person and he's sent off to talk to a steward, but when he finds no one there either, he says he wants to speak to the captain. When he gets to the bridge, he realizes he doesn't have access to enter, but he can see that none of the main crew is awake. Jim heads to the observatory, but when he discovers that the ship is, in fact, 90 years away from Homestead 2, he realizes that he woke up too soon. So he rushes back to the concourse and sends a message back to Earth asking what he should do because he doesn't know how to get back into hibernation. The communication system informs him that this overpriced call to Earth will take around 55 years for Jim to receive any answer. Jim is devastated. He walks around, finds the ship's bar, and finally sees another person. As he's talking to the bartender, something seems strange about him. When he gets him a drink, Jim realizes he's an android. Its name is Arthur. Jim wants to get more information from him, but he can't even explain to the android how it's even possible that he's awake ahead of time. Jim wakes up in his cabin the next day and goes to the cantina, where he quickly realizes that most of the things on the menu are only reserved for gold-class passengers. He gets a basic black coffee and tries to figure out how to fix his hibernation chamber. After Jim collects the tools needed, he manages to get it working again and lies down inside the pod, but nothing happens. Next, he decides to use the tools he found to get into the crew's hibernation chambers, but still no luck. Minor malfunctions happen around the ship. Jim keeps returning to the bar to drink, but mostly to talk to Arthur. The android gives him some advice that convinces him to break into one of the gold classrooms and try to relax, have fun, and enjoy the ship. Jim checks out all the restaurants, the game rooms, and the entertainment suites. Still, as time passes, he becomes even more miserable being there alone. One day he gets drunk and is wandering around the hibernation pods when suddenly he stumbles into an airlock with spacesuits designed for spacewalks. Jim gets into a suit and goes to the airlock, moves a lever and pushes a button to release the airlock door. Once outside the ship, he's mesmerized by the view. He's the only conscious human being experiencing that moment in time. Jim releases the magnets on his boots and floats in space, full of despair. He goes back inside, takes off the suit, but goes back to the airlock without it. He prepares to open the airlock, ready to end his life for good, but changes his mind at the last second. As he runs back, he trips over a bottle. Ouch! Jim gets up and is instantly drawn to a woman in one of the pods named Aurora. He searches for her files in the directory. He listens to her passenger interview, becomes enamored with her, and stays next to her pod for hours listening to her interviews. He reads some of her work back at the bar and talks to Arthur about her writing. He becomes obsessed with the irony of his situation. He was going to another planet for a better life just to end up waking up decades too soon and finding his perfect woman, only for her to be out of reach. Jim continues to think of her and comes up with the idea of waking her up. He talks it over with Arthur, who doesn't quite understand the conundrum. If he wakes her up, it's for his own benefit. He'd knowingly strand her there with him on the ship to die. Jim decides against it at first, but as time goes by, he can't let the idea go. And one day, he changes his mind. He works on her pod and manages to activate it. She starts waking up and going through the same process that he had. He gets cold feet and hides in his room. He goes to the main concourse a while later hoping to find Aurora. And there she is, just as confused as he was a year ago. Jim tells her they're the only ones awake and takes her to the observatory. Then he tells her that he can't access the crew's quarters nor the main commands of the ship. Aurora freaks out at the news and runs back to her pod. When they arrive, Jim explains that no special equipment on board the vessel can help them get back into hibernation, essentially letting her know that they're stranded. They return to the concourse where he tells her that she should rest since she just came out of hibernation. She feels sorry for him, spending more than a year alone on the ship. Jim goes back to the bar full of regret about his decision. He asks Arthur not to tell Aurora that he was the one who woke her up. The next day, Aurora wakes up and returns to the concourse to ask the automated info desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there and they go for breakfast. As they leave, the info desk has some sort of malfunction. In the cantina, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for more than a year and gets him food from the gold class menu. They talk about the possibility of fixing the pods, but unlike Jim, Aurora isn't ready to give up. She searches the infirmary and then goes through research documents looking for clues. Then she tries to break open the doors of the crew's hibernation quarters as Jim notices more faults throughout the ship. Sometime later, Aurora laments about her life on the Avalon. As she spends time writing, running laps on the ship and swimming in the pool, she becomes more aware of her situation. She goes to the cantina to question Jim, thinking his story might be interesting. She asks why he decided to emigrate to the colony. At first, Jim doesn't give her a straight answer, using company slogans, but then opens up that he hoped he could be somebody in the new world, that he could build a life. Later, they hang out in the observatory and Aurora finally shares her reason for being there. Unlike the other passengers on the ship, she has a round-trip ticket. Her idea was to go to Homestead 2 to live there for a year and return to Earth to become the first journalist to document this experience. Aurora begins to lose hope that they will fix their current predicament, but Jim finds a way to cheer her up. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to shoot hoops on the court. Lastly, he takes her to the bar to meet Arthur. She chills out for a while until she remembers their situation. Jim is left alone with Arthur, feeling awful about what he's done to her. We then see him tinkering with something in the observatory. Aurora walks in to find a miniature of the Chrysler building he made for her. Sometime later, they go on a date at the bar. They have dinner and share stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock and they get into the spacesuits. They go out for a spacewalk together. Jim finally has someone to share that magnificent experience with. Jim switches off the magnets on their boots and they float together in space. Talk about romantic. They return inside and immediately kiss, ending up in bed together in his cabin. Soon after, they're living like a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They jog together, eat together, and sleep together. Jim explores the ship further, finds the hydroponics bay, and takes flowers to Aurora. One day, the ship passes by a red giant, and they go to the observatory to marvel at the sight. As it's Aurora's birthday, that night they celebrate in one of the many restaurants on the ship and then on to the bar. Jim goes to the washroom and takes out the ring he made for Aurora while she stays in the bar chatting with Arthur. But the android let slip that Jim deliberately woke her up, unaware that he was still to keep that a secret. Jim comes back and she confronts him in absolute disbelief. She storms off furious. When Jim returns to his cabin, he finds all of her things are gone. He bumps into her in the cantina the next day, but the moment he speaks, she walks off. Aurora is distraught and desperate. One night, she goes over to Jim's cabin and starts to violently assault him, wanting to kill him. Jim tries to talk to her through the comms system because she keeps avoiding him. He tries to apologize and explain why he did what he did. He tells her he fell in love with her, but Aurora doesn't care. She can't forgive him for taking her life. One night, as Jim is in his cabin, the ship's system malfunctions again. The ship faces a critical error this time, and the main command shuts down. Later, he walks into the elevator and it conks out. Aurora walks into the main concourse and sees a tree that Jim has planted there. Then she goes to the cantina where the food dispensary is going berserk. Suddenly, they both hear the voice of the deck chief over the comms asking who planted the tree. They each run to the concourse and see Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and tell the chief about the situation. He doesn't understand how 3 pods could fail. Mancuso takes them to the bridge and he discovers something is wrong with the ship, but the information needs to be collected through the system manually. When they leave the bridge, a robot almost falls on top of them. The pair tell Mancuso that the ship has recently been experiencing frequent malfunctions. Mancuso says that shouldn't be possible as he shows them how to collect the data. Mancuso does a check on the pods, but he figures out what really happened with Aurora's pod and thinks what Jim did was appalling. Later, Mancuso checks the collected data on the bridge and then Aurora joins him. They talk about what happened with her pod, but he tells her there's nothing he can do. Jim walks in with yet another broken robot. Mancuso starts feeling hibernation sickness, so he goes to rest, but as he does so, he starts coughing up blood. That night, Aurora can't sleep, so she goes for a swim. Suddenly, there's gravity loss throughout the ship and she starts drowning as the water from the pool washes over her. The gravity drive resets and she survives, but barely. Aurora and Jim run into each other as they look for Mancuso. On the bridge, the three slowly start piecing together what's been going on with the ship. Mancuso figures out that something happened 2 years ago, taking out a major system. They need to find and fix what has caused the failure because the entire ship is trying to pick up the slack. They don't fix it, the whole vessel will be stranded. They go to find the problem, but Mancuso faints, so Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary. He's dying, and no treatments can stop it or prolong the time he has left. Sometime later, the three of them meet in the observatory. Mancuso gives Jim his ID bracelet, urges them to fix the ship, and dies right there. Suddenly, there's a red alert, and the ship starts shaking. Jim tells Aurora he needs her help, and they run towards engineering. Then there's another failure in the gravity drive. But when the gravity comes back, Arthur starts to malfunction, so Aurora deactivates him. They finally arrive at engineering and start looking for the problem, which they locate in the power plant. But as they open the hatch, Aurora gets sucked in. The asteroid has caused damage to the hull in that location. Jim holds onto the hatch, but it tries to close on him and he gets sucked in too. Thankfully, they quickly manage to seal the breach, but immediately Jim realizes that there is more than one breach in the hull. The two of them follow the trajectory of the meteor and find that it has hit the reactor control computer, but Jim thinks he can find replacement parts for it. They find the part and change it, but the process of venting the reactor still fails, so they try manually, but to no avail. Jim works out that he needs to open the vent door from outside of the ship so they can cool the reactor down. They both head to the airlock, and as Jim gets ready to go outside, he gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet because he might not be coming back. She helps him put on a suit, and as he walks into the airlock, she tells him to come back. She can't live on the ship without him. Aurora returns to the reactor where the temperature has hit critical heights. A bolt from the reactor smashes into her arm. Jim gets closer to the vent from the outside and sees the door. The temperature rises in the reactor room. While Jim is trying to bypass the vent door to open it, he quickly realizes that he'll have to manually hold the door open so the reactor can vent. He tells Aurora, who doesn't like the plan, but he goes ahead with it and tells her to vent the reactor. She doesn't want him to die and they argue, but he says that they must save the others on board and so vents the reactor. It works, but the fumes from the reactor push him away and break his tether. The pressure in his suit is dropping too. He tells Aurora what's happened and she moves as fast as possible to get to another suit and bring him in. He apologizes to her again. She puts on a suit and flies out to rescue him, but her tether is too short. She's pulled back but suddenly grabs onto his tether and manages to pull him in. Aurora drags Jim into the infirmary only to find that he's already dead. She uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and resuscitate him. The medical pod does the work automatically and revives Jim, and Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora fixes Arthur and they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and tells her he's found a way to use the medical pod as a hibernation pod. He tells her to get inside it and wait out the rest of the journey in there. But we later find out that she declines and decides to stay awake on the ship with him. Jim finally proposes to her and they live on the ship for the rest of their lives. 88 years later, the Avalon arrives on Homestead 2. The crew wakes up to find the ship in a very unexpected state. Aurora had left them a message retelling the story of her and Jim's life on the ship, while they were fast asleep. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, turning on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos.